What happens when a life of privilege collides head-on with the unfiltered authenticity of a small town? When the billionaire's son, accustomed to a world of designer suits, private jets, and carefully curated relationships, crashes not just his luxury car but also careens into reality itself? This isn't just another tale of a rich kid's misadventure. It's a story of how one reckless moment can become the catalyst for life-altering transformation. Meet James Evans, the heir to a billion-dollar empire who spent his life collecting social media followers, high-stakes deals, and superficial connections. His world is one of precision, where every move is calculated, every relationship serves a purpose, and spontaneity is reserved for carefully planned photo ops. But when a late-night drive through the winding roads of Willow Creek ends with a stomach-dropping crash, James's carefully constructed world begins to unravel. The small town of Willow Creek, with its dusty streets and tight-knit community, has no patience for entitled outsiders. Here, everyone knows your name and your business. The locals gather at the town's only diner, where Mrs. Henderson serves coffee with side of skepticism. They trade stories about James's accident like it's the biggest event since the 2009 Harvest Festival. And at the center of it all is the one person James never expected to matter, Harper Rodriguez. Harper isn't the type to swoon over wealth or status. With greasy-stained hands and a sharp tongue, she's the mechanic's daughter who calls out James's entitled behavior before he even has a chance to flex his charm. What starts as a clash of worlds gradually transforms into something neither can ignore. But as James and Harper's connection deepens through shared laughter, hard work, and unexpected vulnerability, the past comes crashing back in the form of James's father. Richard Evans, the quintessential self-made man whose ambition has always outpaced his humanity, arrives in Willow Creek to salvage his son's reputation. What he discovers instead is the woman he abandoned decades ago, Carlos, the mechanic, who holds secrets that could unravel everything. As old flames reignite and hidden truths emerge, the line between past and present blurs in ways no one could have anticipated. Will this collision of worlds end in disaster, or will it become the unlikely foundation for a new beginning? The answer lies in the choices they make and the truths they uncover. Because in Willow Creek, sometimes the most life-changing adventures begin with a simple car crash and the people who help you pick up the pieces. So, are you ready to dive into a story where love and legacy collide, where redemption isn't just possible but inevitable, where the billionaire's son learns that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, and the mechanic's daughter discovers that realness has its own kind of magic? Buckle up, because this ride is just beginning. James Evans, the spoiled heir of a billion-dollar empire, sped along the winding roads of Willow Creek in his sleek, black Bentley. The quiet rural town had no place for someone like him, someone used to the fast-paced world of high-stakes deals and designer parties. As he rounded a sharp curve, his phone rang with another demand from his father, and in that moment of distraction, everything changed. The tires screeched, the car swerved, and, with a deafening crash, the Bentley collided with a sturdy oak tree. Glass shattered, metal crumpled, and James found himself disoriented, but remarkably unharmed in the sudden silence that followed. "What the hell?" he muttered, pushing open the bent driver's door and stepping into the crisp morning air. His tailored suit was now dusted with dirt, and his polished shoes were scuffed beyond recognition. The locals began to emerge from their homes and shops, their curious stares making him uneasy. This wasn't like the city, where people averted their eyes or offered immediate assistance. Here, they seemed to relish in his misfortune. An elderly woman tisked disapprovingly, while a young boy whispered something to his mother that made her snort with laughter. James's face burned with embarrassment and anger. He pulled out his phone, expecting to make a quick call to his father's private team, but the screen displayed a frustrating "no service" message. Of all the places to crash, he groaned, trying to mask his panic. His father would be furious. This kind of attention was the last thing they needed. The family's image was everything, and here he was, causing a scene in the middle of nowhere. As he stood there, uncertain of what to do next, he noticed a small, weathered sign pointing to Rodriguez Auto Repair. With a deep breath, he began the short walk, his every step a reminder of his current humiliation. The garage was simple, nothing like the high-tech facilities he was used to back home. The mechanic, a burly man in his late 40s, looked up from underneath the hood of an old pickup truck. "What can I do for you, son?" he asked, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. James tried to put on his most authoritative tone. "My car crashed. I need it fixed immediately. I don't care what it costs." The mechanic raised an eyebrow. "You think I care about what it costs, boy?" he replied, his voice rough but not unkind. "I'll get to it when I can. Now, unless you want to help me push this truck, you can wait." James was taken aback by the mechanic's bluntness. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. As James settled into a rickety chair in the garage's waiting area, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The walls were adorned with fading posters of classic cars, and the smell of oil and sweat filled the air. He glanced at his reflection in a dusty mirror. His perfect hair was now mussed, his expensive suit a mess. This was just the beginning of his troubles, he knew. His father would have a field day when he found out. But for now, James was stuck in this small town with nothing to do but wait and wonder what would happen next. James Evans sat rigid in the mechanic's waiting area, his designer suit feeling increasingly uncomfortable against the gritty wooden chair. The mechanic, whose name tag read Carlos, had been blunt. "This ain't no city garage. Takes time to get parts out here." James glanced at his phone again, still no service. The walls of the small shop were adorned with decades of automotive history, from yellowed racing posters to shelves lined with trophies from local fairs. A clock ticked loudly in the corner, each second stretching James' already frayed patience. He tried to imagine what his father would say when he finally heard about this disaster, not just the damaged car, but the humiliation of being stranded in Willow Creek, where the slow pace of life mocked his high-speed existence. Harper Rodriguez entered the shop with a tray of coffee, her boots stomping determinedly against the dirt floor. "For you," she said, sliding a steaming cup across the counter to James. He looked up, surprised by her boldness. She was the mechanic's daughter, he remembered, sharp-tongued and seemingly immune to his charm. "Black 2 sugars," she added, as if reading his mind. James took a cautious sip, the bitterness cutting through his irritation. "How long does this usually take?" he asked, gesturing toward the garage where Carlos tinkered with what sounded like a lawnmower engine. Harper shrugged. "Dad's got a way of making time disappear when he's working. Could be hours, could be days." James groaned internally. Days? He had meetings, events, a life that couldn't wait on a rural mechanic schedule. To pass the time, James attempted to strike up a conversation with Harper. "So you work here too?" he asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than desperate. She wiped her hands on a rag, oil smudging her already dirty jeans. "When I'm not studying," she replied. "Law school," she added, noticing his surprise. "Impressive," James muttered, though he meant the opposite. "A lawyer in a place like this?" The idea was almost laughable to him. Harper caught his tone. "Not everyone wants to play dress-up in boardrooms," she snapped. "Some of us actually want to do something that matters." James opened his mouth to retort, then closed it. Something in her intensity intrigued him, perhaps the first genuine reaction he'd encountered since arriving in this forgettable town. As hours turned into what felt like an eternity, James found himself observing the rhythms of Willow Creek life through the garage's open bay doors. Farmers drove by on tractors, waving hello to Harper and her father. A woman in overalls stopped to chat about the upcoming harvest festival. Children raced bicycles past, shouting greetings that were clearly familiar. It was a world completely alien to James, who measured his days in meetings and his relationships in strategic alliances. He wondered briefly what it would be like to know everyone, to be part of a community rather than a transaction. The thought was foreign, uncomfortable, and oddly compelling. Harper noticed his staring. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, smirking. James shook his head, just trying to imagine living somewhere where people actually know each other. By late afternoon, Carlos emerged from the garage, wiping sweat from his brow. "Well, have your car ready by tomorrow," he announced. James felt a flicker of panic. Another night in this town. "Can't it be sooner?" he pleaded. Carlos shook his head. "Parts are on order. Take it or leave it." James slumped in his chair, defeated. Across the room, Harper stifled a laugh. "You really are terrible at waiting, aren't you?" she remarked. James glared at her, though without his usual conviction. "You have no idea," he admitted. As the sky outside deepened to twilight, he realized with a strange mix of dread and curiosity that his adventure in Willow Creek was far from over. Somewhere between the crashed car and this unexpected connection, James Evans was beginning to understand that some lessons couldn't be learned at any price, except perhaps the price of humility. James Evans found himself staring at the doorway of the garage as Harper Rodriguez returned from fetching tools for her father. Her presence was magnetic in a way he couldn't quite place. She moved with purpose, her jeans smudged with grease and her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She was the antithesis of the women he usually encountered in high society events. No designer dresses, no carefully curated laughter, just authenticity. "You know," she said, catching him staring, "most people don't gawk when someone's trying to work." James smirked, attempting his usual charm. "Sorry, I'm just not used to realness." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Realness? Is that even a word?" The corner of her mouth twitched, betraying a hint of amusement beneath her tough exterior. James realized, with a start, that he was actually enjoying this banter. Something about her refusal to be impressed by his status was refreshing in a strange way. As Harper worked alongside her father on James' Bentley, she explained the damage in a way that made even the complex mechanics seem accessible. "The front suspension's toast," she said, holding up a bent metal component. "But the engine's actually in decent shape for all the trouble it's caused." James watched, fascinated not just by her knowledge, but by the passion in her voice. "You really love this, don't you?" he asked. Harper glanced up, surprised. "Love it, more than anything. There's something satisfying about taking a broken machine and making it whole again." James felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it envy? He'd never known passion for his work. Everything had always been about the brand, the deal, the image. Harper noticed his silence. "Something wrong, billionaire boy?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. "Just wondering what it's like to care about." "Something real," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. During a lull in the work, Harper pulled out her phone and showed James photos of cars she'd restored, vintage models that told stories of their own. "This '67 Mustang," she said, scrolling to an image of a glossy red vehicle. "I rebuilt the entire engine myself last summer. Took me months, but when it finally roared to life, nothing compares." James found himself genuinely impressed. "You did all that?" he asked. Harper nodded. "Yeah, my dad taught me everything I know. He believes that if you can fix something with your own hands, you've got a kind of power nobody can take away." The words lingered between them, carrying a weight James couldn't quite place. It wasn't just about cars. Harper's words hinted at a deeper philosophy, one that contrasted sharply with the world he'd always known. A world where power was measured in stock prices and social influence. not in the calluses on your hands. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself volunteering to help small tasks at first, like handing tools to Carlos or fetching parts from the cluttered shelves. Harper watched him with a mixture of skepticism and amusement. You know, most rich kids would rather lose a hand than get it dirty, she remarked, as James struggled with a wrench. He grinned, determined to prove her wrong. Maybe not most rich kids. To his surprise, the work was satisfying. There was a clarity to it, a tangible result at the end of your efforts, unlike the boardrooms where decisions could take months, and outcomes were always uncertain. Here, progress was immediate, a bolt tightened, a part secured. Harper caught his eye and nodded approvingly. Not bad for a city slicker, she teased. James felt a warmth in his chest, unfamiliar but welcome. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged his efforts without an agenda. As the sun began to set, painting the garage in golden light, Harper took a break and pulled out a battered copy of The Great Gatsby from her backpack. My dad's been trying to get me to read this forever, she said, sliding into a chair beside James. Says it's about the American dream and all that. James chuckled. Irony much? A billionaire's son reading about the excesses of the jazz age with a mechanic's daughter. Harper frowned. What's your point? James shook his head. No point, just... I never thought it'd be here. Getting my hands dirty, reading Fitzgerald, talking to someone who actually calls me out on my bullshit. Harper smirked. So you do know you're full of bullshit sometimes? James laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that surprised them both. In that moment, between the smell of oil and the fading light, something shifted. Whatever walls James had built around himself began to crack just a little. And Harper Rodriguez, with her grease-stained jeans and sharp tongue, was the first person to see through them. The next morning, James Evans found himself back at the garage, his perfectly pressed suit already collecting dust from the rural air. Harper Rodriguez appeared from behind a pile of engine parts, wiping her hands on a rag that left oil streaks across her palm. "Back for more humiliation?" she asked, her tone sharp but somehow playful. James bristled at the word humiliation. He was used to admiration, not mockery. "I could have your father fired, you know," he blurted, regretting the words instantly. Harper laughed, a rich, unfiltered sound that caught him off guard. "Oh, please. My dad's been fixing cars for this town longer than your family's been throwing money around. Your threats don't work here." James felt the familiar flush of anger, but beneath it, something new, a flicker of respect for her unshakable resolve. As Carlos worked on the Bentley, Harper took a seat beside James, her proximity making him unusually aware of his surroundings. "You know," she began, her voice casual but pointed, "people like you are the reason small towns like this one struggle. You waltz in, expect everyone to bow because of your name, then leave without a second thought." James opened his mouth to retort, but she held up a hand. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen the type before. Your charity galas and photo ops mean nothing when you treat people like they're invisible." Her words stung, hitting closer to the truth than he cared to admit. Back in the city, he'd thrown millions at causes without ever understanding the real impact. Here, in Willow Creek, his money meant nothing, and somehow that realization hurt worse than any critique. Harper turned a wrench in her hands, her focus shifting to a small engine component she'd been examining. "Take this town's harvest festival, for example," she said, not looking up. "The community spends months preparing, and what does your world give us? Nothing. But let a billionaire's son crash his car, and suddenly everyone's talking." James felt the weight of her implication. "I didn't plan to crash here," he said, his voice quieter now. "No one's accusing you of plotting it," she replied, her tone softening imperceptibly. "But maybe, just maybe, you could use this time to see the world outside your window." The challenge hung between them, a gauntlet thrown down with no malice, only honesty. The afternoon wore on, with James attempting to prove himself through small gestures, offering to help Carlos with the heavier parts, listening as Harper explained the intricacies of engine timing. But every so often, she'd catch him in a moment of condescension, patronizing thank you, a subtle dismissal of her expertise, and she'd call him on it instantly. "You don't have to pretend to care," she said during one such moment, her eyes narrowing. "I'd rather you be honest about your boredom than fake this humble act." James paused, studying her. "What if I'm not bored?" he asked. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Prove it. Stay for the festival. Talk to people. Don't just write checks, actually listen." Her words were a spark, igniting something in him he couldn't yet name. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Harper packed up her tools with the efficiency that spoke of years of practice. James watched her, the day's events replaying in his mind. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever seen through his veneer of wealth and power to the person beneath. "You're impossible," he said finally, though without heat. Harper smirked. "Good. Means I'm doing my job." She hesitated, then added, "Just think about what I said. Willow Creek might not be your world, but it's real, and sometimes realness is worth more than all the money in your father's accounts." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the echo of her words and the beginning of a question he'd never before allowed himself to ask. What if there was more to life than he'd been taught to value? The following week in Willow Creek unfolded in a rhythm James Evans never could have anticipated. Each morning, he found himself at the garage before Harper arrived, his once immaculate suits now replaced with worn jeans and a leather jacket he'd borrowed from Carlos. "You look like you actually belong here," Harper remarked one day, smirking as she tossed him a coffee from the shop. "What's next? A flannel shirt?" James laughed, a real, unguarded sound that surprised even him. "Maybe, if it means you'll stop calling me billionaire boy." Harper's eyes softened for a moment before she turned back to the engine she was working on. "Earn it," she said, but there was a warmth to her words that hadn't been there before. Harper began taking James to places around town he'd never noticed in his initial panic. They sat on hay bales at a local farm, watching the sunrise over fields of golden wheat as the farmer explained crop rotations with a pride that surprised James. "This is how we survive," the man said, his hands calloused but steady. "Not with stock, markets, or trust funds, but with what the earth gives us." James listened, struck by the simplicity and strength of the statement. Later at the diner, Harper introduced him to Mrs. Henderson, who'd run the place for over 40 years. "This one's learning," Harper said, nudging James toward the counter. Mrs. Henderson slid a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Best $3.99 you'll ever spend," she declared. James grinned, "Worth every penny." 3. The turning point came during the town's weekly market. Harper dragged James from stall to stall, haggling with vendors over the price of fresh produce and handmade crafts. "See?" she said, holding up a woven basket she'd bought from an elderly woman. "You learn to negotiate here, not in some boardroom." James marveled at her ability to connect with everyone, the baker who saved a loaf of sourdough for her every week, the fisherman who shared stories of his catch over a beer. "You're like the town's ambassador," he said, only half joking. Harper rolled her eyes. "Someone's got to keep you from making a fool of yourself," but her grin gave her away. For the first time, James felt a strange lightness in his chest, like the weight of expectations he'd carried. His entire life was lifting, just a little. 4. During a rare moment of quiet at the garage, Harper found James reading the same copy of The Great Gatsby she'd shown him days earlier. "Still stuck on the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg part?" she asked, leaning against the workbench. James looked up, surprised. "No. Actually, I think I get it now." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Do tell." James hesitated, then said, "It's about wanting something just out of reach, and how sometimes the closer you get, the more you realize it's not what you wanted at all." Harper studied him for a long moment. "Deep," she said finally, "but also true." The air between them shifted, charged with an unspoken understanding. James closed the book, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and clarity. "Maybe I should write my own story," he said quietly. Harper's smile was gentle. "Maybe you should." 5. As days turned into weeks, James' visits to the garage became less about the car and more about the connections he was forming. He helped Carlos tune engines, assisted Harper with homework for her law classes. "He'll never understand why you want to be a lawyer in a place like this," he'd say, to which she'd reply, "Someone's got to protect the little guy," and even volunteered at the town's food pantry one Saturday morning. "This isn't charity," the organizer told him, handing him a box of canned goods. "It's community." The words resonated in a way James couldn't ignore. By the time Carlos announced the Bentley was finally ready for pickup, James felt a surprising sense of dread. "You're leaving?" Harper asked, her tone carefully neutral. James nodded, avoiding her gaze. "I have to." But as he climbed into the newly repaired car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Willow Creek and the people in it had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The days in Willow Creek began to blur together for James Evans, each unmarked by laughter that felt foreign yet exhilarating. He and Harper Rodriguez found themselves working side by side more often, their conversations flowing with an ease that surprised them both. "You know, I never pictured myself fixing cars with a billionaire's son," Harper said one afternoon, her voice light as she tightened a bolt on the Bentley's engine. "And here I am, teaching you how to change oil." James chuckled, his hands covered in grease, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Who would have thought he'd be the one learning life lessons from a mechanic's daughter? The shared joke became a running theme, their banter filled with a chemistry that neither could deny. It was in these moments, surrounded by the smell of oil and the clinking of tools, that James began to understand what small-town romance might actually look like: unfiltered, unpretentious, and undeniably real. Harper introduced James to the art of finding joy in the mundane, a concept that initially made him roll his eyes, but eventually grew on him. They'd spend hours working on the car, their conversations touching on everything from old movies you've never seen Gone with the Wind, barbaric, to the quirks of Willow Creek's residents. One particularly memorable afternoon found them racing toy cars, a gift from an elderly neighbor, across the garage floor, their competitive spirits igniting in a way that had James' sides aching from laughter. "This is the most immature I've been since I was 12, he panted, victorious after a particularly close race. Harper grinned, her eyes sparkling. "Good. Means you're not entirely beyond saving." These moments of levity, paired with the sweat equity of rebuilding the car together, created bonds that no amount of wealth could purchase. The vulnerability came gradually, often when they least expected it. During a rainstorm that trapped them in the garage, Harper shared stories of her mother's passing, a loss that had shaped her resilience and drive. "She taught me how to fix things before she left," Harper said, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing the pain beneath. "Said it would be my armor against the world." James, in turn, confessed the pressure of living up to his family's legacy, the weight of expectations that had always felt like shackles. "I've got everything on paper," he admitted, staring at his reflection in a sheet of polished metal, "but sometimes I feel like I don't have anything real." The raw honesty hung between them, a bridge formed not from grand gestures, but from the courage to be seen. It was in these quiet confessions that their connection deepened, transforming from mutual respect into something tender and unavoidable. One evening, as they worked on the car's electrical system, Harper playfully challenged James to a knowledge swap. "You teach me about the stock market," she said, holding up a wire connector, "and I'll teach you how to wire a car's ignition." James, ever the competitor, agreed. Hours later, they stood side by side, Harper explaining the intricacies of car electrics with the patience of a seasoned teacher, while James broke down investment principles using examples so simple, even a child could understand. "Who knew a billionaire could simplify Wall Street?" Harper teased, as the garage lights flickered to life proof of their combined efforts. "And who knew a mechanic's daughter could make engineering sound like poetry?" James retorted. The mutual learning became a dance of growth, each teaching moment strengthening the foundation of their relationship. The turning point came during the town's annual Harvest Festival, where James found himself helping Harper set up a booth showcasing her father's restored vehicles. As they worked together, stringing fairy lights and arranging vintage cars, a local farmer approached with a problem, a tractor that had died mid-harvest. Without a second thought, Harper grabbed tools and marched toward the trouble, James trailing behind. For hours they worked under the open sky, their teamwork seamless as they diagnosed and fixed the issue. As the tractor roared back to life, the farmer's relieved gratitude was directed at both of them, a moment that crystallized James's transformation. "See," Harper said later, as they collapsed onto hay bales, their clothes dusty but their spirits high. "This is what real impact looks like." James smiled, the weight of his old life feeling increasingly distant. In Willow Creek, he was discovering a truth his money couldn't buy, that love, legacy, and genuine connection were built not through privilege, but through the sweat, laughter, and vulnerability of shared humanity. Richard Evans paced the marble floors of his penthouse, his usually impeccable composure fraying at the edges. The call had come in the middle of a critical board meeting, a journalist asking for comment on his son's rural mishap. By noon, the story had blown up Billionaire'S. Car crash in obscure town becomes local legend. Richard's first call to James had gone straight to voicemail. The younger man's nonchalant message, "Dad, it's fine." Dramatic pause. "I'm fine. The car's a write-off, and he'll explain later," doing nothing to assuage his mounting frustration. "This is exactly why we have PR teams," Richard muttered to his aide, already dictating a statement that emphasized James's unharmed condition and the family's gratitude to local responders. But as the afternoon wore on and James remained unreachable, Richard made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. "Prepare the helicopter," he barked. "I'm heading to Willow Creek myself." The journey to Willow Creek was an exercise in discomfort for Richard Evans. The private jet touched down at a regional airport hours away from the town, forcing him into a rented sedan that groaned under his imposing frame. "Sir, are you certain you want to go through with this?" his driver asked, eyeing the dirt roads marked on the GPS with visible trepidation. Richard's response was a terse nod, his mind already racing through contingency plans. He'd seen small towns like this before, in business deals, places where gossip traveled faster than broadband and where outsiders were met with suspicion. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his son, potentially injured, possibly reckless, and undoubtedly in need of extraction. By the time the car finally rolled into Willow Creek's dusty main street, Richard's usually polished exterior was already beginning to crack. "Find me this mechanic," he snapped, stepping onto uneven pavement that threatened his expensive loafers. "And make sure he understands the concept of urgency." The Rodriguez Auto Repair Shop appeared as a relic from another era, its faded sign creaking in the wind like a warning. Richard stepped inside, his presence immediately drawing the attention of Carlos, who was bent over an ancient lawnmower engine. "You must be Mr. Evans," Carlos said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Richard's response was a practiced blend of authority and charm. "Carlos, I presume. I appreciate your work on my son's vehicle, but I'm afraid we need to expedite things. Time is money, as I'm sure you understand." The mechanic straightened slowly, oil-stained hands resting on his hips. "In Willow Creek, Mr. Evans, time is something we respect, and your son, he's been learning that lesson firsthand." Richard felt a flicker of irritation. This was not how things were done in his world, where efficiency was paramount and emotions were liabilities. But as he opened his mouth to press further, his gaze landed on a faded photograph tucked into a clipboard on the counter. Something in the image, a youthful face, a familiar smile, made his blood run cold. The photograph showed a younger Richard, arms slung casually around a woman whose face was half obscured by the glare of a college graduation cap. Carlos followed his gaze, his expression softening imperceptibly. "That was a long time ago," he said, quietly. Richard's mind raced. This man, this mechanic, knew him, knew his past. Before he could formulate a response, the shop door swung open and Harper Rodriguez strode in, her presence immediately altering the room's dynamics. "Dad, James Iso." She froze, her sharp gaze taking in Richard's tailored suit and the tension in the air. Richard felt an odd twist of recognition. Had he seen this young woman somewhere before? Her eyes, her smile. There was something unsettlingly familiar about her. "Harper," Carlos said gently, "this is Mr. Evans, James' father." The words hung in the suddenly charged atmosphere as Harper's expression shifted from curiosity to caution. Richard, meanwhile, was preoccupied with a disconcerting thought. Why did this girl remind him of someone he'd once loved and lost? James arrived at the shop shortly after, his jeans dusty and his hair windblown, clearly unaware of the storm his father's presence had unleashed. "Dad? What are you doing here?" he asked, his surprise genuine but laced with a hint of the old defiance that had defined their relationship for years. Richard turned to face him, his usual composure warring with the confusion stirred by the photograph and Harper's unsettling familiarity. "I heard about the accident," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "and I thought it was time we had a conversation about priorities." Harper watched the exchange from the shadows, her instincts telling her this was more than a simple parental intervention. There was history here, hidden, complex, and waiting to be uncovered. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garage floor, Richard made a decision that would alter everything. "Pack your things, James," he said finally. "We're leaving tomorrow, but first, I need to speak with Carlos alone." The request, delivered with all the gravity of a boardroom ultimatum, left James and Harper exchanging worried glances. Whatever secrets Willow Creek held, they were about to be laid bare. Richard Evans stood frozen, the weathered photograph still clutched in his hand. The imager younger him, arms wrapped around a woman whose face was now familiar, yet somehow forgotten, brought a rush of memories he'd buried for decades. "Elizabeth," he whispered, the name tasting like ashes on his tongue. Carlos, now standing across from him, removed his grease-stained cap, revealing hair that had once been dark and full, but now was flecked with gray. "You remembered," Carlos said. Quietly, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of pain. Richard's mind raced. This woman, this mechanic, was Elizabeth Rodriguez, the woman he'd loved and abandoned in his quest for fortune. The woman who'd written him letters for years, letters he'd never had the courage to open. "Why didn't you tell me you were here?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion he couldn't control. Carlos crossed her arms, the old wound still fresh. "Why would Ike? You made it clear my world wasn't worthy of yours." The tension in the garage was palpable as Richard struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the girl from his past. Elizabeth Carlos, whatever name she'd chosen, she was the key to a chapter of his life he'd tried to erase. "I came back after graduation," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. But you were already gone chasing boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. Richard opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but the words died in his throat. No explanation could justify the callousness of his abandonment. Instead, he gestured weakly toward the photograph. I kept this. All these years, I kept it. Carlos snorted, unimpressed. Kept it hidden, you mean? Like you hid everything else that mattered. The accusation hung in the air, a testament to opportunities. Lost and hearts broken. Harper watched the exchange from the shadows, her mind whirling. Her mother had rarely spoken of Richard Evans, but the pain in her eyes when she did was something Harper had grown up with. Now, seeing him in the flesh, this man who'd broken her mother's heart and seemingly moved on without a backward glance, filled her with a strange mix of anger and curiosity. "So, you're the great Richard Evans," she said, stepping into the light. Richard turned, startled by her presence. "Harper," Elizabeth Carlos said sharply, "it's complicated." But Harper shook her head. "No, it's not. He left you. He built his empire on your broken promises. And now he shows up here, acting like he can just pick up where he left off." Her words were a challenge, and Richard felt their impact deeply. This young woman, with her mother's eyes and her own sharp tongue, was a living reminder of everything he'd lost. James entered the garage just as the confrontation reached its peak. The air was thick with unspoken truths and long-held resentments. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze shifting between his father, Harper, and the mechanic he now knew. As Elizabeth, Richard turned to face him, the photograph still clutched in his trembling hand. "James, there's something I need to tell you," he began, but the words caught in his throat. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath. "Your father and we had a history, a long time ago." James's confusion was evident. "You knew my dad?" he asked Harper, who shook her head slowly. "I had no idea." The revelation created a rift in the room, old wounds reopening and new questions surfacing. Richard, realizing the gravity of the situation, made a decision. "We need to talk," he said firmly. "All of us, now." The small office above the garage became the staging ground for truths long deferred. Elizabeth perched on the edge of a workbench, her posture rigid with decades of unaddressed pain. Richard paced, his usual confidence shattered. James and Harper stood side by side, their earlier connection now strained by the revelations. "I was young," Richard began, his voice breaking, "naive. I thought love was something that could wait, that ambition was more important." Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. Ambition? Or fear? Richard stopped pacing, meeting her gaze. "Fear," he admitted, quietly. "I was afraid of loving someone who wouldn't fit into the world I was building." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Harper, watching her mother's face soften ever so slightly, felt a spark of understanding. This wasn't just about the past, it was about the present and the future that might still be rewritten. The air in the garage office was thick with unspoken words as Richard Evans and Elizabeth Rodriguez-On's lovers, now strangers connected by time and regret, faced each other across the chasm of years. "You could have written," Richard said suddenly, the words escaping before he could filter them. "One letter, that's all I ever asked." Elizabeth's eyes flashed with the pain of old wounds. "And you could have stayed," she retorted, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "But you chose your empire over us." The accusation hung between them, a testament to the missed opportunities and broken promises that had defined their past. James and Harper, standing side by side near the door, exchanged uneasy glances. This was more than a simple family secret. Was the collision of lives that had been irrevocably altered by choices made decades ago. Richard stepped closer, his presence filling the small space as he reached out hesitantly toward Elizabeth. "I've regretted it every day," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Elizabeth flinched. At his touch, memories flooding back late nights, studying by lamplight, whispered promises under starlit skies, the crushing pain of his departure. "Regret doesn't fix things," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It doesn't bring back what was lost." James watched the exchange with growing unease. His father, usually so controlled, was unraveling before his eyes. Harper, meanwhile, felt a strange mix of sympathy and suspicion. Was this man genuinely remorseful, or was this another performance for the benefit of his image? The uncertainty gnawed at her. As the tension reached a breaking point, Elizabeth turned abruptly toward the window, her back to Richard as she fought to regain her composure. "I built a life here," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her sacrifices. "A good life, something real." Richard's hand dropped to his side, his hope dimming. "And I built mine," he replied, though the emptiness in his voice betrayed the hollowness of his achievements. But what kind of life is it when you are always wondering about the road not taken? The question hung in the air, a challenge neither could fully address. Harper, sensing the rising emotion, stepped forward. "This isn't just about you two," she said, her voice steady but firm. "It's about the people you've affected, about the choices that echo through generations." Her words struck a chord, reminding everyone present that this confrontation wasn't just about old love, it was about the present and the possibility of redemption. James, unable to stay silent any longer, cleared his throat and directed his question to Elizabeth. "Why did you stay in Willow Creek?" he asked, curiosity overriding his earlier discomfort. Elizabeth turned, her gaze softening as she considered the young man who, in many ways, resembled the Richard she'd once loved. "Because this is where my heart has always been," she said simply, "and because running away never solves anything." Her words carried a weight of wisdom that made Richard wince. How many times had he run from his emotions, from his past, in the name of progress and success? Harper nodded slowly, as if absorbing the lesson. "And now?" James pressed gently. Elizabeth's smile was faint but resolute. "Now it's about whether we're brave enough to face what we've become and what we might still be." The confrontation reached its crescendo as Richard made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everyone's lives. "I want to make things right," he said firmly, his gaze locking with Elizabeth's. "Not for the media, not for my company, not for any of that. For us, for the people we've hurt." Elizabeth's initial skepticism melted slightly at the sincerity in his eyes. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard took a deep breath. "Starting with the truth. All of it." His words hung in the air, a promise that carried the weight of possible redemption. Harper and James exchanged a glance. This could be the beginning of something new, or the unraveling of everything they thought they knew. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, Elizabeth finally nodded. "Tomorrow," she said. "We start tomorrow." The following morning dawned with a heaviness that mirrored the emotions swirling within the garage's office. Richard Evans sat across from Elizabeth, his posture rigid with anticipation. Harper and James stood together near the doorway, their presence a silent testament to the interconnected fates that had brought them here. "I need to know the truth," Richard said, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. Elizabeth's gaze dropped to her hands, which twisted nervously in her lap. "After you left," she began, her voice trembling, "I found out I was pregnant." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, their implications sinking in slowly. James' breath hitched. Harper's eyes widened in shock. Richard stared at Elizabeth, his mind racing to comprehend the revelation. "Harper," he whispered, turning to face the young woman who bore such a striking resemblance to Elizabeth in her youth. "You're my daughter." The admission carried a weight that transformed the room's atmosphere from tense to outright stunned. Harper felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the truth settled in. Her mother, Elizabeth, the mechanic, had kept this secret for decades, and Richard Evans, the billionaire who'd abandoned her mother, was her biological father. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to protect you from his world," she said, her gaze flicking to Richard. "From the pain of being a footnote in his empire." Richard stepped forward, his expression a mask of genuine remorse. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "If I'd known—" Harper cut him off with a bitter laugh. "If you'd known what? You'd have sent a check? A trust fund?" Her words cut deep, exposing the chasm between Richard's world and the life Harper had built. James, meanwhile, stood frozen, his mind racing to process what this meant for his relationship with Harper, for everything. The room fell into a charged silence as the weight of the revelation sank in. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Richard stood helplessly, torn between comforting her and addressing Harper's fury. "This changes nothing," Harper declared, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "You left. You chose your empire over us, and now you waltz back in like you can fix everything with an apology?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but James stepped forward, his presence grounding the moment. "Harper, wait," he said gently, placing a hand on her arm. "We need to hear everything before we decide what this means." Harper pulled away, her anger undiminished. "What's there to hear? He abandoned us. And you," she turned to Richard, her gaze blazing, "you get to waltz back in and disrupt everything we've built?" The accusation hung in the air, a challenge that Richard knew he must answer, not for himself, then for the daughter he'd never known he had. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for the difficult truth he'd avoided for so long. "I was given a choice," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up. "Stay with you with Elizabeth and give up my career, or pursue the opportunities that would define my family's legacy." He paused, the weight of his words evident. "I chose wrong." The admission was a blow to his pride, but necessary. Harper's expression softened imperceptibly, her anger clashing with a strange, reluctant understanding. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why after all these years?" Richard met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the pain of decades. "Because your mother's shop was listed as the repair place for your accident, and when I saw her name, Elizabeth Rodriguez, it triggered something I'd buried." He gestured to the photograph from college, still resting on the table between them. "I couldn't ignore it anymore." As the weight of the revelation continued to settle, James found himself torn between his growing feelings for Harper and the shock of this new reality. He stepped closer to her, his presence offering silent support. "Well, figure this out together," he said quietly, his words a promise of solidarity. Harper glanced at him, her anger momentarily abated by his reassurance. Richard, noticing the exchange, felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy, or perhaps recognition of the bond that had begun to form between his son and daughter. "This family," he said finally, his voice carrying a mix of hope and trepidation, "isn't just about blood. It's about the choices we make now." Elizabeth, still tearful, nodded. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next." The room's atmosphere, though still heavy, began to shift away from anger and toward the possibility of understanding. For the first time in decades, Richard allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was within reach. James Evans felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Richard's revelation settled in. Harper strong, witty Harper, who challenged him and saw through his defenses. was his half-sister. The thought was a dagger to his heart, slicing through the connection they'd built over the past weeks. "This can't be happening," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roaring in his ears. Harper, equally stunned, turned to face him, her earlier anger forgotten in the face of this new reality. "James, I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "None of us did." The distance between them suddenly felt vast, an unbridgeable chasm. Where moments before there had been camaraderie and growing affection, Richard, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "We need to verify this," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes reflecting the turmoil beneath. "A DNA test. That's the only way to be certain." The drive to the nearby clinic was agonizingly silent, the air thick with unspoken questions and fears. James sat in the back seat of Richard's rented car, his mind racing. How could he have fallen for his half-sister? The irony, the cruel twist of fate, was not lost on him. This was the billionaire's son twist he'd heard about in tabloids, only this time it was his life playing out like a dystopian fairy tale. Harper, sitting beside him, stole glances at his pale face, her heart aching. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but the revelation had built an invisible wall between them. At the clinic, the process was clinical and impersonal, a quick cheek swab, a brief exchange of information, and then they were back in the car, the sample sealed in a small plastic tube that felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Back at the garage, Elizabeth prepared a pot of coffee, her hands shaking despite her efforts to remain composed. "Well, no, in a few days," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her anxiety. James paced the small room, his agitation palpable. "A few days. I can't wait a few days," he said, his voice rising. "My entire life is a lie now." Harper flinched at his words, though she understood the pain behind them. Richard placed a hand on James' shoulder, a gesture that usually offered comfort, but now felt hollow. "We need to be patient," he said. "The truth will come out when it's ready." Harper sank into a chair, her mind racing. What if the test confirmed what they all feared? How would that change things between her and James? Between all of them? The questions circled in her head like vultures, picking at the remains of her peace of mind. That evening, Harper retreated to her small apartment above the garage. James' stunned expression seared into her memory. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay grounded, to see through people's facades, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The sound of her phone ringing startles her from her reverie. "It's James. We need to talk," he says, his voice tight with emotion. Harper hesitates, then agrees to meet him at the old mill on the outskirts of town, a place they'd visited once, where the water's gentle rush had provided the perfect backdrop for their easy conversations. As she arrives, she finds James pacing the wooden platform, his usual confidence replaced by visible distress. "What if it's true?" he asks before she can speak. Harper's heart breaks at the vulnerability in his voice. "What if it isn't?" she counters, stepping closer. "We can't know until the results come back." Her words are a lifeline, and James grasps them, pulling her into an embrace that speaks of comfort rather than romance. For now, they're suspended in a limbo of uncertainty, their future hanging on a test result that could either shatter their world or open a new path forward. The waiting was torture for James. Each hour that passed without results felt like a lifetime. He found himself avoiding his father, whose presence now reminded him of the hidden truths that had shaped their lives. Harper, too, was distant, though he caught her watching him with a mix of sympathy and something that might have been lingering affection. On the third day, Richard received the call. The lab had the results. As they gathered once again in the garage office, the tension was almost physically present. Richard opened the envelope, his hands steady despite the turmoil within. Harper and James stood side by side, their eyes locked on Richard's face as he read the findings. The moment stretched eternal, until finally Richard looked up, his expression a mix of relief and profound sadness. "It's negative," he said quietly. "Harper is not my biological child." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation hanging. In the air, Harper turned to James, her eyes searching his. "So what does this mean for us?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty and hope in equal measure. Richard Evans stared at the DNA results in his hands, the scientific confirmation bringing both relief and heartache. Harper Rodriguez was not his biological daughter. The child he'd fathered with Elizabeth had been stillborn, a tragedy Elizabeth had endured alone while Richard built his empire in another state. Harper was the product of Elizabeth's later relationship with a college professora man who had loved her unconditionally and helped her raise Harper after his untimely death. The truth was a double-edged sword. It meant James and Harper were not related by blood, but it also revealed the depth of Elizabeth's resilience and the sacrifices she'd made to protect her daughter from Richard's world. "She built a life here," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of admiration and regret, "a life I had no part in." Harper listened to Richard's explanation with a mix of relief and lingering anger. "So you're saying I'm not your daughter?" she clarified, her voice steady, but her eyes searching for the truth in Richard's expression. Richard nodded. "I'm saying you're free of me," he replied, the words carrying a finality that pained him. "Free to choose your own path without the burden of my legacy." Harper felt a strange lightness in her chest, release from the invisible chains that had bound her to Richard's secrets. James, standing beside her, squeezed her hand gently. "This changes everything," he said, his voice carrying the hope they'd both been clinging to. Harper turned to him, her smile tentative but genuine. "Or maybe it changes nothing," she said, "except now we get to decide what comes next." Elizabeth, hearing the news from Richard, felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Harper wasn't tethered to Richard's bloodline warred with sadness over the life they'd never had. "I should have told you sooner," she said to Harper that evening as they sat together in the quiet of the garage apartment. Harper shook her head. "You did what you thought was best." Her words were forgiving, but her eyes held a quiet determination. "Now it's my turn to choose." Elizabeth smiled through her tears. "I'm proud of the woman you've become." Harper hugged her mother tightly, the bond between them strengthened by the trials they'd weathered. As they parted, Harper glanced at the photograph of Richard and Elizabeth from college, their young faces filled with promise and dreams that had been fractured by time and choices. "Maybe it's time to let some things go," she said gently. Elizabeth nodded. "Maybe." James and Harper found themselves alone together for the first time since the revelation, the air between them charged with unresolved tension and newfound possibility. "We're not siblings," James said finally, the words breaking the heavy silence. Harper laughed, a sound that carried both relief and humor. "Just two people who nearly became a disaster thanks to a mix-up and a billionaire's bad choices." James grinned, the familiar spark returning to his eyes. "So where do we go from here?" he asked, his thumb brushing hers in a gesture that spoke of both comfort and something deeper. Harper's answer was a question of her own. "Do you want to find out?" The unspoken with me hung between them, a bridge waiting to be crossed. James closed, the distance, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both familiar and new, a promise of a future untainted by the past. As the days passed, the residents of Willow Creek began to notice the subtle changes in James Evans. the once arrogant billionaire's son, now volunteered regularly at the food pantry, helped Carlos with engine repairs, and even joined Harper at her law school study sessions. Rumors swirled about the billionaire's son twist that had nearly torn the town apart. But the real story was one of redemption and unexpected connections. Richard Evans, too, found himself altered by the experience. He donated a substantial sum to the town's community center, a gesture that surprised everyone but made perfect sense to those who'd witnessed his transformation. "It's the least I can do," he said quietly to Elizabeth during a rare civil conversation. "For everything I took from you," she nodded, her forgiveness a balm for his weary soul. And so, amidst the chaos and revelations, a new chapter began, not with grand declarations, but with small acts of kindness, honesty, and the courage to build something real from the rubble of the past. In the weeks that followed the DNA test results, James Evans and Harper Rodriguez navigated their relationship with a newfound clarity and purpose. The garage, once a place of tension and revelation, became their sanctuary, a space where they could rebuild their connection free from the shadow of family secrets. "So, billionaire's son," Harper teased one afternoon as they worked side by side on a vintage Ford, "still think you can teach me about the stock market?" James grinned, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Only if you promise not to. Laugh at my beginner mistakes." Their banter, once charged with unspoken tension, now carried the weight of shared truth and the promise of a future untainted by the past. The residents of Willow Creek began to notice the transformation in both James and Harper. At the local diner, Mrs. Henderson slid a plate of blueberry pancakes in front of James, her usual sharpness softened by genuine warmth. "Harper says you're staying a while," she said, her eyes twinkling. James nodded, unable to hide his smile. "As long as I'm welcome." Across town, farmers who had once regarded him with suspicion now waved hello, recognizing the change in his demeanor. Harper watched these interactions with quiet pride. "You're becoming one of us," she said one evening as they walked through the Harvest Festival grounds, the air filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and hay. James took her hand, his grip steady. "Only because you showed me how." Their relationship deepened through moments both grand and ordinary, a shared sunset over the fields, studying for Harper's law exams together in the garage apartment, even arguing passionately over the best approach to fixing a particularly stubborn engine. "You're impossible," Harper would say, exasperated but smiling as James demonstrated yet another city slicker solution that surprisingly worked. These moments, filled with laughter and the kind of vulnerability that only comes with time, solidified what they both already knew: their love was real, unforced, and built on the foundation of truth rather than convenience. "We don't get to choose where we come from," James said one night as they sat on the garage roof, stargazing, "but we get to choose where we go." Harper leaned into him, her heart full. Together, she agreed. Richard Evans, witnessing the transformation in his son, found himself reflecting on his own choices and the paths not taken. He spent hours in the garage, not just overseeing the business aspect of Carlos' shop, but actually participating, helping Harper with inventory, discussing expansion plans with Carlos that would benefit the entire town. "You're different, Carlos," observed one afternoon as they worked on a vintage tractor. Richard nodded, his hands calloused from labor that once would have been beneath him. "Fatherhood will do that to a man." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Even adopted fatherhood?" Richard paused, meeting his gaze. "Especially adopted fatherhood." The honesty between them marked the beginning of a fragile but genuine friendship, built not on shared history, but on the possibility of shared future. Harper, too, found herself redefining her relationship with her mother. Elizabeth Rodriguez, once burdened by the weight of hidden truths, gradually opened up about her past, the love she'd once shared with Richard, the pain of his abandonment, and the joy of raising Harper in a town that had become her home. "You deserve happiness," Elizabeth said one evening as they prepared dinner together, her voice carrying the wisdom of a lifetime. Harper hugged her tightly. "And so do you." The words were a promise, a recognition that the past couldn't be changed, but the present offered endless possibilities. As the seasons turned in Willow Creek, bringing with them new challenges and opportunities, the Evans-Rodriguez families began to weave their fates together, not as fractured entities, but as a tapestry of redemption, love, and unexpected connection. Richard Evans stood alone in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below like distant stars. The DNA test results had confirmed what he'd always feared and simultaneously never expected. Harper was not his biological daughter. But the revelation had unearthed more than just family secrets. It had forced him to confront the choices that had defined his life. The photograph of his younger self and Elizabeth, once a cherished memory buried under layers of success and denial, now sat prominently on his desk, a daily reminder of the love he'd abandoned in pursuit of empire. He traced the edges of the image with a finger, the guilt and regret mingling with a strange sense of hope. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to wonder, what if I could make things right? The answer came not in grand gestures, but in the quiet determination to change. Richard began by reaching out to the colleagues and friends he'd neglected over the years, people who had once been close but had drifted away as his ambition consumed him. He organized dinners, made amends for missed birthdays and unreturned calls, and listened more than he spoke. "You're different," his oldest friend Maria commented during one such gathering. Richard smiled. Fatherhood tends to have that effect, even the unconventional kind. The process of reconnecting was slow and often painful, but each apology accepted and each relationship mended chipped away at the armor of isolation he'd built around himself. Back in Willow Creek, Richard threw himself into community projects, a new wing for the town's community center, scholarships for students pursuing technical trades, and a fund to support local businesses. "This isn't a publicity stunt," he told Carlos during the groundbreaking ceremony for the community center expansion. "This is me trying to be the man I should have been decades ago." Carlos, ever the pragmatist, simply nodded. "Good. We could use someone who remembers where they came from." The townspeople, initially skeptical, gradually warmed to Richard's sincerity. Children ran up to him with questions about his cool car, and elderly residents shared stories of the town's history, stories Richard listened to with genuine curiosity. The most challenging confrontation, however, was with himself. Richard hired a therapist, a move that would have been unthinkable in his earlier years of self-reliance and denial. During sessions, he unpacked the fears that had driven his ambition, the terror of poverty after his family business failure when he was a child, the need to prove himself in a world that had once looked down on him. "You built an empire to fill a void," his therapist observed gently, "but voids can't be filled with money or power." Richard left those sessions with homework, journaling, meditation, acts of service that gradually helped him replace old patterns with new, healthier ways of being. He began to understand that true legacy wasn't measured in stock prices, but in the lives touched and the hearts healed. The culmination of Richard's journey came during Willow Creek's annual Founders' Day celebration. Standing before the entire town, he announced a permanent endowment for the community center in Elizabeth's Namia gesture that drew gasps and applause. "This woman taught me what it means to build something real," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Something that outlives you, that serves others, that matters." Elizabeth, standing beside him with Harper and James at their sides, felt tears welling up. For the first time in decades, Richard Evans faced his past not with shame or denial, but with acceptance and a commitment to growth. The crowd's standing ovation wasn't for the billionaire, it was for the man who had finally found his way home. The Evans and Rodriguez families gathered in the garage apartment for a Sunday dinner that marked a new beginning. Richard, dressed casually, in a button-down shirt and jeans, helped Elizabeth set the table while James and Harper prepared the meal together, a fusion of Richard's love for fine cuisine and Harper's talent for hearty, home-cooked dishes. Who would have thought he'd be making meatloaf in a billionaire's kitchen? Harper teased, as James stirred a pot of what he insisted was gourmet gravy. Richard overheard and laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Who would have thought I'd have a reason to care about meatloaf? The easy camaraderie marked a shift from the tension and revelations of the past weeks. Over dinner, stories flowed. Elizabeth shared memories of Harper's childhood antics. James recounted his father's infamous no-sick-days policy during his youth. And Richard admitted to a youthful prank involving a stolen fraternity banner that had nearly cost him his degree. Laughter echoed through the apartment, healing old wounds with its melody. "This is nice," Harper said quietly to James as they cleared the dishes. James nodded, his heart full. "Feels like home." The words carried weight. They both understood a home built not on bloodlines or wealth, but on chosen connection and mutual respect. The following weekend found the group collaborating on a community garden project proposed by Harper for her law school community service requirement. Richard and Elizabeth worked together on securing permits and funding, their interactions marked by a newfound respect and camaraderie. "You're surprisingly good at this bureaucratic stuff," Richard remarked, as Elizabeth navigated the town hall red tape with the patience of someone who'd spent years understanding small-town politics. Elizabeth smiled. "Practice makes perfect." Meanwhile, James and Harper built raised planters and taught local children how to plant heirloom vegetable seeds, a task that saw James's initial ineptitude transformed into surprising green thumbs under Harper's guidance. "Who knew city boys could garden?" one child quipped. "Never judge a book by its cover," James replied, earning a proud grin from Harper. As the garden began to flourish, so did the relationships within the group. Richard and Elizabeth resumed their college tradition of late-night study sessions, now centered on town planning documents rather than law textbooks, their conversations revealing layers of shared history and missed opportunities that had once defined them. Harper and James, meanwhile, found their romance deepening through shared goals and mutual support. "You're not just a mechanic's daughter," James said one evening as they watched the sunset over the garden. "You're a force of nature." Harper rolled her eyes but kissed him anyway. "And you're not just a billionaire's son," she replied. "You're someone who chooses to stay, to fight, to love." Their words, simple but profound, underscored the transformation that had taken place in all their hearts. The culmination of their bridge building came during the garden's harvest festival, where the entire town gathered to celebrate the fruits of their labor, literally and figuratively. Richard delivered a speech that moved many to tears, acknowledging the town's resilience and the lessons he'd learned from its people. "This garden isn't just about food," he said, gesturing to the abundant produce displayed on tables. "It's about what happens when we choose to grow together rather than apart." Harper stood beside him, her hand resting possessively on James's arm as he listened with pride. Elizabeth watched from the sidelines, her heart full as she recognized the truth in Richard's words. In mending their emotional wounds, they had built something stronger than any of them could have imagined, a family forged not by accident, but by intention and love. Months after the car crash that had upended his life, James Evans stood at the edge of the community garden, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant patchwork of vegetables and flowers. The accident, once a source of humiliation and inconvenience, had become the catalyst for profound change, not just in his life, but in the lives of everyone it had touched. "Who would have thought," Harper said, joining him with a basket of freshly picked tomatoes, a crashed car leading to a garden. James chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Rich meets real," he said, quoting one of her favorite phrases, "and the real wins every time." The words carried the weight of their journey, a journey from arrogance to humility, from isolation to community, from brokenness to wholeness. Richard Evans, watching from a distance, felt a strange peace settle over him. The garden, with its carefully tended rows and buzzing activity, symbolized everything he had once overlooked in his pursuit of success: connection, growth, legacy. As children ran through the sprinklers set up for the festival and elderly residents exchanged recipes for tomato sauce, Richard realized that true wealth wasn't measured in net worth, but in net impact, the positive ripples you created in the lives of others. He joined Elizabeth at a table where they shared iced tea and memories, their conversation easy and unforced for the first time in decades. "We did good," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "Not perfect, but good." The festival wound down as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. James and Harper walked hand in hand toward the garage apartment, where a small celebration awaited with friends and family. "So," James said, squeezing her hand, "what's next for us?" Harper smiled, her eyes reflecting the setting sun. "More adventures, bigger dreams, and maybe a few more car crashes to keep things interesting." James laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "As long as we fix them together." Their footsteps fell in rhythm, a testament to the bond that had grown from chaos and revelation into something lasting and true. As the stars emerged, Richard and Elizabeth stood together at the garden's edge, watching the town they both loved embrace the change that had come. "I never thought I'd find my way back here," Richard admitted quietly. Elizabeth took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Sometimes life takes you on detours to bring you where you need to be." Her words mirrored the wisdom she'd shared with Harper months earlier, the same wisdom that had helped guide them all through turmoil to redemption. Richard nodded, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in decades. "To second chances," he said, raising his glass in a toast. Elizabeth smiled, "and to the road not taken finally walked." The story of James Evans' car crash in Willow Creek became legend in the small town, a tale of how an accident had sparked a journey of love, truth, and reconciliation. Tourists would later visit the community garden, reading the plaque that read, "From chaos to community, a testament to second chances." And the residents, who had once judged James for his arrogance and Richard for his absence, now spoke of them with respect and warmth. For in Willow Creek, it wasn't just the people who had changed. It was the very spirit of the town, renewed by the courage to face the past and the hope to build a future together. As the seasons turned and the garden continued to thrive, the Evans and Rodriguez families stood as living proof that even the most fractured stories could be mended in moment, one choice, one heartbeat at a time. So what did you think of the journey we've just explored together? The story of James Evans and Harper Rodriguez began with a simple car crash in Willow Creek, but evolved into a profound tale of love, identity, and redemption. From the initial tension between James and Harper to the shocking revelation of their biological connection, or lack thereof, the narrative took us through a roller coaster of emotions. The transformation of Richard Evans from a self-absorbed billionaire to a man seeking genuine connection and redemption is one of the most compelling arcs in this story. His journey reminds us that it's never too late to face our past and make amends. For James and Harper, their relationship evolved from a clash of worlds to a deep, authentic connection built on truth and vulnerability. Their love story isn't just about romance, it's about personal growth and the courage to embrace a future that looks different from what they once expected. As we conclude this chapter, I'd love to hear from you. What moment impacted you the most? Did you see the family revelations coming? Or were you as shocked as James and Harper? And what do you think the future holds for the Evans and Rodriguez families? Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story and share it with friends who might appreciate this emotional journey. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, whether it's about the characters' decisions, the unexpected twists, or what you'd like to see happen next in Willow Creek. And most importantly, follow our channel to stay updated on future videos. There are more stories of love, legacy, and redemption waiting to be told, and I promise they'll be just as captivating as this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Willow Creek. Until next time, keep exploring the magic in everyday moments and the potential for transformation in every relationship.